The red and blue lights appear behind you just as you're finishing a long day drive, the kind where your mind is already halfway home before your car even slows down. You pull over, hands steadying on the wheel, watching in the mirror as the patrol car settles in behind you. The officer steps out, measured pace, one hand near his belt, eyes scanning your vehicle before he even reaches your window. He taps on the glass. You lower it. And then it comes. Almost casually, but carrying weight you immediately feel in your chest. Good evening. Do you have any weapons in the vehicle? Or sometimes it's even sharper than that. Are you carrying any firearms tonight? The air changes when that word enters the conversation. Gun, firearm, weapon. It doesn't matter how lawful you are, how careful you've been, or how many times you've trained for this exact moment in your head. Real-life encounters don't feel like training. They feel slower, heavier, like every second is being measured in someone else's control. Have you ever been pulled over or approached by police while legally carrying a firearm, or been asked whether you have a weapon on you during a stop? And before you scroll past that question, this is important. Share your experience in the comments section. Because what most people don't realize is that these encounters are where a lot of lawful gun owners unknowingly give up ground they didn't even know they had to stand on. And later in this discussion, there's a simple, almost overlooked phrase that changes the entire direction of these interactions when things start to feel tense or unclear. Most people never think about that moment until they're already living it. Now here's what's interesting. The officer asking about weapons is not random. It's not small talk. It's not curiosity. It's a calculated safety question shaped by training, experience, and worst-case scenarios they are taught to anticipate from day one. In their world, every unknown becomes a potential risk factor. A routine traffic stop can turn in seconds, and firearms are one of the variables that instantly elevate that risk calculation. But what most gun owners don't understand is that the way you respond in those first few seconds often matters more than the fact that you are armed in the first place. Let's break that down in a real way. Imagine a driver who immediately blurts out, "Yes, I have a gun, it's in the glove box, I've got my permit, I swear I'm legal," all at once, fast, slightly panicked. From the driver's perspective, they're being cooperative. From the officer's perspective, that can sometimes register as heightened anxiety, rushed disclosure, and unclear intent. Not because the person did anything wrong, but because the tone and speed of the response adds uncertainty to an already sensitive situation. Now imagine another driver who pauses, breathes, and says something calm like, "Officer, what is the nature of your concern?" That small difference in control, in timing, in wording, can completely shift the interaction. Not because it changes the law, but because it changes perception. Police officers are trained to read micro behaviors constantly. Hands, eye movement, delays in response, sudden over-explanation, even silence. None of these are automatically good or bad, but they all feed into how the officer assesses whether they are dealing with a routine stop or something that could escalate. And firearms add a second layer to that assessment. In some states, there is a duty to inform requirement, meaning if you are carrying concealed and you are asked, you must disclose. In others, there is no legal obligation unless specifically required by a permit condition or circumstance. Then, there are constitutional carry states where lawful carry does not require a permit at all, which often leads to confusion during roadside interactions because not every officer immediately knows the laws of every state they patrol, especially near borders or in high-travel areas. That's where a lot of problems begin. Not with bad intentions, but with mismatched assumptions. Now picture a different scenario. You're a passenger in a vehicle. The driver has no firearm, but you do. The officer doesn't know that yet. The stop is routine until the officer notices something during conversation. Maybe a bulge, maybe a comment, maybe a registration check that flags a concealed carry permit in the system. Suddenly, the attention shifts. Is there anything in the vehicle I need to know about? Weapons? Firearms? Now, both the driver and passenger are being evaluated simultaneously. One wrong movement toward a pocket, glove box, or center console can instantly change tone. Not because anyone is guilty, but because officers are trained to assume that unknown hand movements are potential access movements. That's the part most gun owners underestimate. It's not just what you say. It's what your body does while you say it. And this is where nervousness becomes dangerous in ways people don't expect. A lawful gun owner might instinctively reach for their wallet while saying, "I have my permit in here," without thinking. But from outside the vehicle, that movement can look like a reach toward a firearm. That split-second interpretation can escalate everything. Commands become sharper. Distance increases. Hands are ordered out of the vehicle. And suddenly, what should have been a calm disclosure becomes a controlled extraction of uncertainty. Officers don't want that outcome. Most do not want escalation, but they are trained to prioritize control of unknown variables, especially weapons. Now let's talk about something many gun owners misunderstand completely. You are not legally required in most situations to volunteer information beyond what the law requires in your jurisdiction, but many people overdisclose out of fear, thinking more information equals more safety. In reality, excessive, disorganized explanation can sometimes create confusion about what exactly is happening, where the firearm is located, and whether it is accessible. There's a difference between cooperative communication and uncontrolled verbal flooding. One builds clarity, the other builds uncertainty. And in tense encounters, uncertainty is what officers are trying to reduce. This is where we need to talk about something most people never prepare for, even if they carry every single day: the psychological pressure of being questioned about a firearm while someone in uniform is watching your every movement. Your brain wants to solve the situation quickly. You want to appear honest. You want to avoid misunderstanding, so you talk more, you explain more, you justify more. But at a certain point, the conversation stops being helpful and starts becoming noise. And that's exactly the moment where many experienced carriers rely on something simple, controlled, and deliberate. 6 words that do not argue, do not escalate, do not over-explain, and do not accidentally waive rights in a moment of stress. I am choosing to remain silent. 6 words. Not aggressive, not defensive, not evasive in the criminal sense. Just a clear invocation of a constitutional protection that exists specifically for moments where pressure and uncertainty collide. Now, this is where people often misunderstand what that actually does in real life. It does not end the stop. It does not prevent lawful commands. It does not stop identification requests where legally required. It does not erase the presence of a firearm. What it does is set a boundary on unnecessary self-incriminating conversation when the situation is already tense or unclear. And in firearm-related stops, clarity matters more than volume. There are situations where saying nothing at all beyond required identification is the safest course. There are also situations where immediate, calm disclosure of a legally carried firearm is required by law or practical safety. The key is not panic-driven speech. It's controlled, lawful communication. Now consider how quickly things can shift. A driver calmly informs the officer they are carrying as required. The officer responds by asking the driver to keep hands visible and possibly requesting that the firearm remain in place or be secured temporarily during the stop. In some jurisdictions, the officer may ask the driver to step out while they handle the weapon directly. That moment is sensitive because it involves transfer of control over a legally possessed item. Many lawful gun owners are surprised when that happens, thinking possession alone guarantees full autonomy during a stop. But officer safety protocols allow for temporary control of firearms in certain circumstances, especially during traffic stops where proximity inside a vehicle increases risk. And here's the part that rarely gets discussed openly. Compliance does not mean surrendering rights, but confusion about the difference between compliance and consent can lead people to unknowingly agree to searches or handling they did not have to allow. When an officer asks, "Do you mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" that is a consent-based question in many contexts. A nervous, "Sure, go ahead," can open doors that were never legally required to be opened, and once consent is given, it is often legally valid even if the person later regrets it. That's why emotional pressure is such a critical factor in these encounters. Now, layer in interstate travel complications. A lawful carrier from a constitutional carry state might assume their rules apply everywhere, but crossing into a duty-to-inform state or a jurisdiction with different transport requirements can instantly change obligations. Suddenly, what felt routine becomes legally sensitive, and both driver and officer may be relying on incomplete or outdated assumptions. Then there's vehicle storage law. Loaded firearms in glove compartments, center consoles, or under seats are treated differently depending on state law, intent, and accessibility. Officers are trained to think in terms of reachability during a struggle inside a confined space. That is why placement matters as much as legality. And here's a reality most people don't expect. Even when everything is legal, behavior can still shape outcomes. A calm, controlled driver who provides minimal but clear answers often experiences a very different interaction than a driver who is overly talkative, visibly anxious, or constantly moving hands toward compartments, even if the intent is innocent. It's not about acting suspicious. It's about understanding how suspicion is formed in real time under pressure. There are also myths that circulate heavily in gun communities. One of the most common is that simply saying you are armed immediately makes everything safer. That is not always true if it is done abruptly, without context, or while reaching toward the firearm. Another myth is that officers always know concealed carry laws in every state perfectly, which is simply not realistic, given jurisdictional differences and constant legal changes. The truth is more layered. Every encounter is shaped by timing, tone, law, and perception all interacting at once. And somewhere in the middle of all of this is that 6-word phrase again. Not as a trick, not as a loophole, but as a steady anchor when conversation starts to drift into territory that feels pressured or unclear. I am choosing to remain silent. It is not about avoiding accountability. It is about preventing unnecessary complications in a moment where emotions, authority, and legal responsibility intersect under stress. Because once words are spoken under pressure, they cannot be taken back. And once assumptions form during a stop, everything that follows is filtered through them. There are countless stories from lawful gun owners who walked away from stops thinking everything went fine, only to later realize they volunteered details that were not required, consented to searches they did not need to allow, or created confusion about their firearm handling simply because they were trying too hard to be cooperative in the wrong way. And there are just as many stories where calm, controlled communication kept everything simple, professional, and uneventful. The difference is rarely luck, it's awareness. And when you understand how quickly a routine interaction can shift once a firearm enters the conversation, you start to realize that the most important skill is not just knowing your rights, but knowing how to protect them in real time without escalating the situation you are trying to keep calm. So the next time that knock on the window comes, and the officer's eyes briefly scan toward your center console or waistband, the moment will feel familiar in a different way. Not because it is easy, but because you have already thought about what pressure feels like when it arrives unexpectedly and how quickly words can either stabilize a situation or complicate it. And in that silence between question and answer, that brief space where everything is decided faster than most people realize. What you choose to say next can define the entire direction of what happens on the side of that road.